How did the world's most feared army, the war machine that conquered Europe in months, crumple into a nightmare of ice, hunger, and paranoia? This is not the story of a single lost battle. It is the story of the collapse of an idea, the chronicle of how blind arrogance led the Third Reich to its own destruction, dragging its generals into the abyss. This is the anatomy of the fall, seen through the eyes of those who commanded the apocalypse. Before the cold, there was glory. In the early 1940s, Berlin was not a capital, it was the center of the universe. On its wide avenues, the sound of marching boots echoed like the heartbeat of a nascent empire. Crowds vibrated in hypnotic ecstasy as military parades displayed the might of the Wehrmacht. Red, white, and black flags covered every building, symbols of a nation rising from the ashes of humiliation to claim its destiny. Germany believed itself invincible, and the world, terrified, was beginning to agree. Each victory seemed to confirm the Reich's manifest destiny. Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France. Nations fell like dominoes, some in weeks, others in days. Europe, which had once dictated the world's rules, now trembled before the German tactic of blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Hitler saw himself not merely as a chancellor, but as a modern conqueror, a Germanic Caesar, destined to shape history for 1,000 years. His generals, once cautious, now walked amid applause, their uniforms impeccable, and smiles of restrained triumph on their faces. Arrogance became palpable, a drug that intoxicated the high command. Failure was not a possibility, it was heresy, a mathematical impossibility. In the gilded halls of the Reich Chancellery, the map of Europe was a masterpiece of conquest. Red lines sliced through entire territories, and each occupied city was crossed out with almost childlike pride. "Nothing can stop us," said a minister. And the generals, intoxicated by success, agreed in unison. War was no longer seen as a political risk or a humanitarian disaster, but as a grand spectacle, and the public applauded every act. Confidence grew so much that prudence vanished, replaced by a collective delirium of power. The German war machine, with its panzer tanks advancing like steel blades and its Stuka dive bombers screaming in the skies, seemed like a force of nature, a divine entity of destruction. It was at this climax of hubris that Hitler announced the plan that would seal his fate. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. Most believed it would be the final coronation, the definitive victory. 3 months and Moscow will be ours, they said in the corridors of power, a phrase repeated like a sacred mantra. The Russian colossus, they believed, was a giant with feet of clay, ready to crumble at the first touch. The delirium of blind victory replaced military logic. The Reich, at its zenith, marched with firm step and blindfolded eyes toward the greatest mistake of its existence, ready to awaken a beast they did not know they could contain. The illusion was perfect, but its foundation was as fragile as glass. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m., the silence on the eastern border was broken by the roar of thousands of engines. More than 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,600 tanks and 2,700 aircraft, crossed the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Stretching across a 2,900-kilometer front, it was the largest and most audacious military offensive in history. For the German High Command, it was the final act of their spectacular war. The Luftwaffe in the first days annihilated the Soviet Air Force still on the ground, securing supremacy in the skies. The panzer divisions led by generals like Heinz Guderian penetrated deep into enemy territory, encircling entire armies in massive pockets. It seemed like France all over again. A quick, clean, inevitable victory. At the beginning, everything seemed to confirm Hitler's prophecy. Radios in Berlin broadcast spectacular advances. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell. Hundreds of thousands and then millions of Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. Goebbels propaganda announced the imminent collapse of the communist regime. Generals on the front toasted with cognac, celebrating what seemed like the disintegration of the enemy. But reality, as always, was more complex and darker. In the eyes of the older officers, veterans of the First World War, a subtle unease began to emerge. Russia was not France. It was a different entity, a vast and unpredictable sleeping beast. And they knew that a wounded beast does not flee. It retreats, licks its wounds, and waits for the moment to strike. Soon, the very vastness of Russia revealed itself as a formidable enemy. The dirt roads, which seemed passable in summer, turned into rivers of mud with the first autumn rains, the dreaded Rasputizo. Supply trucks bogged down, tanks lost traction, and the legendary German logistics began to fail. Supply lines which needed to cover ever greater distances stretched to the breaking point. General Guderian, the master of armored warfare, sent a grim warning to the high command. "We will not reach Moscow before winter." Hitler, in his delirium of omnipotence, ignored the warning. For him, will was superior to matter, and the Führer's will was law. As cities fell, the Red Army did not disappear. Under Stalin's brutal command, who called the people to a great patriotic war, the enemy reorganized. Entire factories were dismantled and transported beyond the Ural Mountains, out of the Luftwaffe's reach. New armies were formed at a frightening speed. The enemy that should have crumbled was in fact rising again with desperate resilience. By the end of August, the German army had advanced more than 1,000 kilometers, but at a terrible cost. Half of its vehicles were disabled. Motorized divisions operated at less than half strength. On the maps in Berlin, the arrows still pointed forward, but on the battlefield, the pace slowed. The lightning war, the pride of German strategy, began to lose its energy, choking on the mud and Russian immensity. The perfect machine began to creak, and winter, with its icy breath, was drawing ever closer.
In October 1941, with time running out, Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, the final and desperate offensive to capture Moscow. The Soviet capital, the symbolic and strategic heart of the regime, was only a few hundred kilometers away. Victory seemed within reach, a final thrust that would end the war in the east before the dreaded Russian winter fully set in. The panzer divisions, the army's spearhead, advanced in two giant pincers led by Generals Guderian and Hoppner. Some reports claim that the most advanced German officers could see the Kremlin towers through their binoculars. Euphoria returned briefly, a last vest of hope before the disaster. The high command held its breath, awaiting the coup de grace. But time, relentless, became the main enemy. Autumn gave way to an early and brutal winter. Snow began to fall, covering the landscape with a white and treacherous blanket. Temperatures plummeted to -20, -30, and in some places -40 degrees Celsius. The German army, prepared for a summer campaign, was not equipped for that frozen hell. Winter clothing promised by Berlin never arrived in sufficient quantities. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspapers and scraps of cloth to avoid frostbite. Tank and truck engines froze and refused to start. Gun lubricant thickened, rendering them useless. Bullets sometimes shattered like glass in rifle barrels. The war that should have been quick had turned into a slow torture. General Franz Halder, Chief of Staff, recorded the growing anguish in his diary. "The troops are exhausted. Our lines are stretched too thin." As the Wehrmacht stalled, the Red Army, accustomed to its own winter, prepared the counterattack. On December 5, 1941, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers, including fresh and well-equipped Siberian divisions for the cold, attacked the exposed and exhausted German flanks. For the first time since the war began in 1939, the Wehrmacht was not advancing, but retreating in disorder. The shock was profound. Generals on the battlefield requested permission for a strategic withdrawal to save their men and equipment. Hitler's response, isolated in his headquarters, was furious and inflexible. He forbade any retreat, calling it cowardice. "The German soldier does not retreat," he bellowed. Hundreds of high-ranking officers, including Guderian, were dismissed for disobeying orders they considered suicidal. The defeat at the gates of Moscow marked the first major setback for the Third Reich and the definitive turning point of Operation Barbarossa. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered, smashed against the ice and Soviet determination. The lightning war, which promised to end in weeks, had turned into a bloody quagmire of attrition. By the end of that winter, more than 750,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, missing, or captured. The High Command's confidence melted with the spring snow. Halder wrote in his diary the phrase that summed up the new sentiment: "The war is lost unless there is a miracle." But no miracle came. Only more cold, more bodies, and the growing certainty that Germany in its arrogance had gone too far. The lightning had gone out in the snow. After the trauma of the 1941 winter, the summer of 1942 brought a new wave of optimism to the German High Command. The Wehrmacht, though wounded, was still a formidable force. Hitler, desperately needing a victory to reaffirm his strategic genius and fuel his war machine, turned his attention to the south. The plan, codenamed Operation Blue, was ambitious: capture the vital oil fields of the Caucasus, and in the process take a city that stretched along the Volga River. That city had a name that made it an irresistible prize for Hitler's vanity: Stalingrad. For Hitler, taking the city named after his arch-enemy meant a personal and ideological humiliation for Stalin. For the Soviets, defending it became a matter of national honor, a symbol of the homeland's very survival. Stalingrad was more than a point on the map. It was the pride of both sides at stake. The German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus advanced relentlessly. The Luftwaffe subjected the city to such intense bombing that it turned it into a sea of ruins and smoke. Buildings became concrete skeletons, and streets turned into an infernal labyrinth of debris. The Germans believed the conquest would be quick. They were wrong. Within the ruins, the Soviet defenders fought with a ferocity that shocked German veterans. Every destroyed building became a fortress, every basement a machine gun nest. Places like the tractor factory, the grain mill, and Pavlov's house entered legend as symbols of impossible resistance. The battle for Stalingrad degenerated into a savage fight, house by house, floor by floor, man by man. The life expectancy of a newly arrived soldier on the front line was less than 24 hours. It was a meat grinder, consuming entire divisions in weeks. In November 1942, as the Sixth Army was bogged down in this urban hell, Marshal Zhukov prepared his trap. With Operation Uranus, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers attacked the German army's flanks, defended by poorly equipped and demoralized Romanian and Hungarian troops. In days, the unthinkable happened. The Sixth Army, with about 300,000 men, was completely encircled. Paulus, realizing the catastrophe, begged Hitler for permission to break the siege and retreat. Hitler's response was the same at Moscow: "Stand firm, the Stalingrad fortress will not be abandoned." He promoted Paulus to field marshal, a subtle reminder that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The Luftwaffe, under Göring's command, promised massive air resupply, an air bridge that would keep the army alive. The promise was a lie. Only a fraction of the necessary supplies arrived. The siege became a frozen prison.
With temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius, no food, no ammunition, and no hope, the Sixth Army collapsed. Men died frozen in their improvised shelters, while others succumbed to hunger and disease. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, defying Hitler's implicit order, surrendered. Of the nearly 300,000 encircled soldiers, fewer than 90,000 survived to march to Siberian prison camps. Very few would return home. In Berlin, Goebbels' speech at the Sportpalast, calling for total war, was a hysterical attempt to disguise despair. But it was too late. The myth of German invincibility was dead and buried in the ruins of Stalingrad. For the High Command, the truth was now undeniable. The war could no longer be won. Stalingrad was the point of no return. After the catastrophe of Stalingrad, the Third Reich entered a state of psychological collapse. Defeat was no longer a secret kept in generals' diaries. It was an open wound, visible to the entire nation. The High Command tried to maintain a facade of control, but frontline reports were alarming. Tank production could not keep up with losses, Allied bombings began pulverizing German cities and factories, and the army, bleeding on two fronts, was dangerously exhausted. The confidence that had once sustained Hitler's authority evaporated, replaced by paranoia, fury, and an incessant search for scapegoats. In the summer of 1943, in a last and desperate attempt to regain the initiative in the east, Hitler ordered Operation Citadel, a massive offensive against a Soviet salient near the city of Kursk. This will be the turning point of the war, he declared. Generals like Erich von Manstein hesitated, warning that the Russians knew of the attack and were prepared. But Hitler, needing a victory at any cost, ignored the warnings. The largest tank battle in history was about to begin. On July 5th, nearly 2,700 German tanks, including the new and feared Tiger and Panther, advanced. On the other side, Marshal Zhukov awaited them with nearly double the number of tanks and a defense network with more than 20,000 anti-tank guns. The ground trembled. "It's hell," wrote a Waffen-SS officer. "Tanks explode like torches, and the sky is black with smoke." The new German tanks, the pride of Reich engineering, proved vulnerable. Many broke down due to mechanical failures before even seeing combat. Quality could not overcome quantity. In the Battle of Prohorovka, a chaotic collision of more than 1,000 tanks in open fields, the German offensive was halted. In a week, the army lost hundreds of its best armored vehicles. The Blitzkrieg was dead and buried, forever. Hitler, furious, canceled the operation. From Kursk onward, Germany would never attack successfully in the east again. The army would only retreat, step by step, to Berlin. The war, for the more lucid officers, was militarily lost. This external collapse accelerated the internal one. The certainty of defeat gave rise to a previously unthinkable idea. If Germany could not be saved with Hitler, perhaps it needed to be saved from Hitler. Colonel Henning von Tresckow, a veteran of the Eastern Front, summed up the growing sentiment. It's no longer about winning the war, but about saving Germany from itself. A conspiracy began to take shape, gathering officers, politicians, and intellectuals who saw the Führer as the nation's gravedigger. Names like General Ludwig Beck and later the charismatic and maimed Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg became central to the movement. It's no longer a matter of morality, it's a matter of national survival. As Hitler isolated himself more and more in his headquarters, the Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, surrounded by fanatical aides and screaming at generals who brought bad news, the conspiracy gained strength. The climate of terror turned the high command into hostages of their own obedience. The conspiracy's plan was simple and suicidal. Assassinate Hitler with a bomb during a meeting and use an emergency plan, Operation Valkyrie, to seize control of the state. The day was set, July 20th, 1944. The fate of Germany, which had once seemed in the hands of massive armies, now rested in the contents of a single leather briefcase.
With temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius, no food, no ammunition, and no hope, the Sixth Army collapsed. Men died frozen in their improvised shelters while others succumbed to hunger and disease. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, defying Hitler's implicit order, surrendered. Of the nearly 300,000 encircled soldiers, fewer than 90,000 survived to march to Siberian prison camps. Very few would return home. In Berlin, Goebbels' speech at the Sportpalast, calling for total war, was a hysterical attempt to disguise despair. But it was too late. The myth of German invincibility was dead and buried in the ruins of Stalingrad. For the High Command, the truth was now undeniable. The war could no longer be won. Stalingrad was the point of no return. After the catastrophe of Stalingrad, the Third Reich entered a state of psychological collapse. Defeat was no longer a secret kept in generals' diaries. It was an open wound, visible to the entire nation. The High Command tried to maintain a facade of control, but frontline reports were alarming. Tank production could not keep up with losses, Allied bombings began pulverizing German cities and factories, and the army, bleeding on two fronts, was dangerously exhausted. The confidence that had once sustained Hitler's authority evaporated, replaced by paranoia, fury, and an incessant search for scapegoats. In the summer of 1943, in a last and desperate attempt to regain the initiative in the east, Hitler ordered Operation Citadel, a massive offensive against a Soviet salient near the city of Kursk. This will be the turning point of the war, he declared. Generals like Erich von Manstein hesitated, warning that the Russians knew of the attack and were prepared. But Hitler, needing a victory at any cost, ignored the warnings. The largest tank battle in history was about to begin. On July 5th, nearly 2,700 German tanks, including the new and feared Tiger and Panther, advanced. On the other side, Marshal Zhukov awaited them with nearly double the number of tanks and a defense network with more than 20,000 anti-tank guns.
The ground trembled. "It's hell," wrote a Waffen-SS officer. "Tanks explode like torches, and the sky is black with smoke." The new German tanks, the pride of Reich engineering, proved vulnerable. Many broke down due to mechanical failures before even seeing combat. Quality could not overcome quantity. In the Battle of Prohorovka, a chaotic collision of more than 1,000 tanks in open fields, the German offensive was halted. In a week, the army lost hundreds of its best armored vehicles. The Blitzkrieg was dead and buried, forever. Hitler, furious, canceled the operation. From Kursk onward, Germany would never attack successfully in the east again. The army would only retreat, step by step, to Berlin. The war, for the more lucid officers, was militarily lost. This external collapse accelerated the internal one. The certainty of defeat gave rise to a previously unthinkable idea. If Germany could not be saved with Hitler, perhaps it needed to be saved from Hitler. Colonel Henning von Tresckow, a veteran of the Eastern Front, summed up the growing sentiment. It's no longer about winning the war, but about saving Germany from itself. A conspiracy began to take shape, gathering officers, politicians, and intellectuals who saw the Führer as the nation's gravedigger. Names like General Ludwig Beck and later the charismatic and maimed Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg became central to the movement. It's no longer a matter of morality, it's a matter of national survival. As Hitler isolated himself more and more in his headquarters, the Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, surrounded by fanatical aides and screaming at generals who brought bad news, the conspiracy gained strength. The climate of terror turned the high command into hostages of their own obedience. The conspiracy's plan was simple and suicidal. Assassinate Hitler with a bomb during a meeting and use an emergency plan, Operation Valkyrie, to seize control of the state. The day was set, July 20th, 1944. The fate of Germany, which had once seemed in the hands of massive armies, now rested in the contents of a single leather briefcase.
Berlin, July 20, 1944. At 12:42 p.m., a violent explosion rocked the meeting room at the Wolfschanze headquarters. The bomb, placed by Colonel Stauffenberg, detonated. The news raced quickly to Berlin. The Führer is dead. For a brief and hopeful moment, it seemed the nightmare had ended. In Berlin, the conspirators initiated Operation Valkyrie, attempting to seize control, but fate was cruel. Hitler survived. The heavy oak conference table protected him from the full force of the blast, leaving him with only minor injuries. At 4 p.m., German radio broadcast the news that sealed the coup's failure. Our Führer lives. Hope turned to panic. Hitler's revenge was swift and brutal. Stauffenberg and other leaders were executed that same night. In the following months, the Gestapo hunted down and executed thousands of people, eliminating the last organized opposition within the Reich. The regime, now purged of any dissenting voice, plunged fully into madness. The year 1945 began with the Reich crumbling on all fronts. In the West, the Allies, after the success of D-Day, crossed France and approached the Rhine. In the East, the Red Army steamroller crushed the last German defenses and advanced on Prussia. Germany was being squeezed in an iron vice. While Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Yalta to discuss the future of the defeated country, Hitler hid in the parallel reality of his bunker beneath the Chancellery in Berlin. Isolated 12 meters underground, he refused to accept reality. The bunker was a world apart. Stale air, dim artificial light, the smell of mold and despair. There, a trembling, aged, and ill Hitler spent his days poring over maps, moving divisions that no longer existed. "Steiner's attack will break the siege," he shouted at his generals, referring to a phantom army. When General Krebs, head bowed, informed him that Steiner had no troops to attack, Hitler exploded in the final outburst that became legendary. "Treachery! Everyone has betrayed me." Paranoia was total. He ordered the arrest of Göring for trying to seize power, and cursed Himmler for attempting to negotiate with the Allies. The empire he built was sinking, and he sank with it, into a pit of fury and self-pity. Above the bunker, Berlin was hell. The constant sound of Soviet artillery was the soundtrack of the apocalypse. Buildings collapsed, civilians died in the streets, and SS units hanged anyone who tried to flee or raise a white flag. 15 and 16-year-old Hitler youth were sent with anti-tank weapons to certain death against Soviet T-34s. It was a grotesque and symbolic resistance. On April 28th, news arrived that Mussolini had been captured and his body hung upside down in a Milan square. Hitler understood his fate. On the night of April 29th, he married his longtime lover, Eva Braun, and dictated his political testament. On April 30th, around 3:30 p.m., a dry bang echoed in the bunker's corridor. Hitler and Eva Braun were dead. The Führer's war had ended. The next day, Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children before committing suicide. The fall of the gods was sordid, pathetic, and final, occurring in a concrete tomb, while the city they swore to glorify burned above their heads. With the fall of Berlin and Hitler's suicide, the Third Reich disintegrated. On May 7, 1945, at 2:41 a.m., in a small school in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl, his face marked by exhaustion and defeat, signed Germany's unconditional surrender to the Western Allies. With this signature, the German people and armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the hands of the victors, he said with a choked voice. The next day, May 8th, the ceremony was repeated in Berlin, this time under the cold and implacable gaze of Soviet Marshal Zhukov. The bloodiest war in human history in Europe had ended. The silence that followed the ceasefire was, for many, almost as deafening as the noise of the bombs. The nightmare was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. In November 1945, the world turned its eyes to the German city of Nuremberg. In the defendant's dock, at the Palace of Justice, sat the faces that had commanded the war. Hermann Göring, the vain Luftwaffe commander; Wilhelm Keitel, the servile chief of staff; Alfred Jodl, the strategist, and other military, political, and industrial leaders of the Reich. It was an unprecedented spectacle. For the first time in history, leaders of a nation were being tried by an international tribunal for their actions. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated, declared the American chief prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson, in his opening speech. The goal, he stated, was not revenge, but justice. The defendant's defense rested on a central argument, a phrase that would echo for decades. Befehl ist Befehl, or order is an order. They presented themselves as soldiers, bureaucrats, men who had merely done their duty to the fatherland. Göring, arrogant and defiant, tried to turn the trial into a stage, defending his actions as those of a patriot. Keitel, on the other hand, seemed a broken man, weeping as he heard the charges and repeating that he had only obeyed orders. "Obeying orders is the basis of the army," he said. But the prosecution dismantled this defense with a mountain of evidence. The Germans' own meticulously archived documents became the most damning proof. Keitel and Jodl's signatures were on orders for the execution of prisoners of war, the deportation of Jews, the scorched earth policy. The myth of the honorable soldier who fought cleanly while politicians committed the crimes collapsed. The footage of concentration camps shown in the courtroom shocked the world and silenced even the most cynical defendants. When the sentences were read, the hall was in absolute silence. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Göring, Keitel, and Jodl. 7 received long prison terms. Göring escaped the gallows by committing suicide with a cyanide capsule hours before the execution. The bodies of the executed were cremated, and their ashes scattered in a river, so no grave could become a shrine. Nuremberg not only punished the guilty, it established a revolutionary principle. Blind obedience to criminal orders is not a duty, it is a crime. The trial marked the symbolic end of the Third Reich, exposing the complicity of its leaders in a system based not only on war, but on crimes against humanity itself. After Nuremberg, Germany plunged into a period known as Stunde Null, the zero hour. The country was in ruins, not just physical, but moral. Generals who survived the war and the trials, like Erich von Manstein and Albert Speer, were imprisoned and forced to confront the legacy of the regime they had served. In their memoirs written years later, many tried to draw a thin line between military duty and criminal complicity. Manstein, considered one of the war's most brilliant strategists, insisted, "I fought for Germany, not for Hitler." It was an attempt to salvage the army's honor, separating the soldier from the politician. But the documents, the diaries, and the events themselves told a different story. The truth, admitted by few at the time, was that the High Command knew the war was lost long before the end. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, confessed in his interviews, we knew since Stalingrad, perhaps even before. We just didn't have the courage to admit it, not to others, nor to ourselves." The failure to take Moscow in the winter of 1941 was the first shock, the first crack in the armor of invincibility. The Stalingrad catastrophe in 1943 was the brutal confirmation that victory was impossible, and the defeat at Kursk that same year was the final nail in the coffin of German initiative in the East. Everything that followed, the desperate defense of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the fanatical resistance in Berlin, was not a fight for victory, but a conscious prolongation of the agony. So why did they continue? Why did the generals who saw the naked and raw reality on their maps continue to send millions of men to death in a lost war? The reasons are a complex tangle of fear, opportunism, and distorted loyalty. There was the paralyzing fear of Hitler, who did not hesitate to execute anyone he considered a traitor. There was the personal oath of loyalty to the Führer, which many took to the grave. There was also the cynical hope that by prolonging the war in the East, they could achieve a separate peace with the Western Allies, joining them against the common enemy, Soviet communism. And for some, there was simply the inertia of a war machine that didn't know how to stop, a blind obedience that had become an end in itself. The war ended, but the questions echoed for decades, defining the identity of post-war Germany. Children born after 1945 asked their parents, "What did you do? Did you know?" And often silence was the only answer. The generation of officers who served the Führer carried forever the weight of having obeyed too much and questioned too little. Historian Ian Kershaw summed up the process perfectly. The collapse of the Third Reich was not sudden. It was a slow sinking in which everyone on board knew the ship was going down, but the captain refused to give the order to abandon, and the crew, out of fear or loyalty, refused to jump. And so ended the saga of the German High Command, not with a cry of defiance, but with the heavy and enduring silence of complicity, a silence that, to this day, still speaks.